what's on my mind at the moment? I suppose no different from everything else that's been on my mind previously. Obviously we are in a particular traumatic uh, traumatic existence at the moment. Which everyone is going through with this lockdown. I've been a little bit fortunate in that I have the space, so I've been able to come here and spend some time, and while I'm clearing my head thinking, I've been able to grow some food, which I'm I've been reaping the harvest of and enjoying. I live in a tower block, so that makes it even more important for me, and especially now because the builders have moved in. They've clad the building in scaffolding and mesh, so you feel a little bit like prison. And then they've done that, and now they're drilling outside on the walls, so it's like really aimed at sending you absolute crazy. So to come here with some natural wildlife, birds, and just fresh air, it's been godsend, really. I use this space for working as well. I use it for thinking, and my thinking isn't always photography. I tend to use whatever material presents itself to me. So sometimes I paint, I would make sculptures in various forms, and in fact perhaps the allotment is part of something that I curate every year. It's very different, and fortunately this year it has worked out pretty much to plan, in that most of the plants have been obliging and have grown where they should have. The only one that let me down is my French beans, and I'll have to look at the soil for that next year. A lot of people know, as I said, me from the photographs that I've taken, but much more than that, mine is about how do we preserve aspects of our life, of our culture, for future generations, of which the photographs becomes just a part of that. So there's the documentation, which is the taking photograph, and to some extent the collection is part of the whole documentary. But then my personal thought on the whole thing really delves around what I make, the little sculptures I make, my thoughts and things, and like I say, how I curate this space. But the photographs, they for me are or were a response to racism, which I encountered, or we as a people were encountering in the 70s, 80s, and 60s, 70s, 80s. And what was happening is a lot of the press was really, most of what you saw in the press was negative. It was about, disease-ridden people coming to take our jobs on our women, and and we felt racism, the nasty hands of racism in all manner and form of life, whether we're in education, in church, in the law, health, wherever it is. And people have been demonstrating and protesting over the years, ever since I've been here, and it has been our only tool, if you like, to redress or try to redress some of the harsh realities of our lives here. But it has largely been unrecorded. It's not been recorded, if you like, by the mainstream. They've always found it's almost like what you have to say is not relevant or not important or not of any value. We have African Liberation Day, for example, which is an event which takes place in Handsworth Park. Well, when it took place in Handsworth Park, it was reported. Okay, it wasn't exactly welcoming to press, because at those sort of events, the idea is that people should. It's about self-help. It's about doing things for yourself, and it's about doing it without others, perhaps as important. Not needing help. but nonetheless, the only documentation of that sort of material is the one that's been produced. So those conversations have been taking place where there's, death in police custody is very common, and other forms of demonstration. And so it seems quite interesting that this year being, we have the Black Lives Matter as a result of the killings in America. It seems quite interesting and perhaps important just to, if you like, revisit some of our protests ourselves to see how, if you like, those protests haven't had an impact, although they were quite strong as far as we're concerned. And whenever some of these protests did have an impact, invariably the response from the authorities would be to employ a few more black people in positions of power, and they would move in rightfully qualified for the job, and they're qualified people, which is all fine. But I think what tends to happen sometimes is that those people strive to be like the people who are oppressing them. And I suppose they're basically trying to be, like the community around them, and we live in a class based society. So once you have gained a certain kudos, acceptability by certain groups of people, you feel the need to act accordingly. So, for example, you might then, having had one of these jobs, you want to send your kids to private school, you want to move out of the area, you're no longer middle class, so you're not, you don't want to be treated the same as, there's a difference, your university degree is evidence of that difference that you have, that there is. And then I imagine all the guys, when we have these incidents, riots, demonstrations, and they're arrested and brutalized by the police, what tends to happen is their life gets blighted, and we see them, sometimes on the street corners, or betting shops or places like that, and the very people who had the jobs as a result of their action drive past them with their kid in the car and say, if anything in life, promise me you'll never be like one of those guys. And for me, you're only as strong as the weakest link, and I think it's important that we as a people not forget one particular group of people. Coming back to the photographs, which I know you want me to talk about, the crowd shot in Handsworth Park is a good example of togetherness. There in 1977, there was a rally in Handsworth here, Africa Liberation Day. I refer to it as African Liberation Day. And it's an event which takes place in a black city with a fairly large black population, where people from the Pan-African movement organize an event, which is a 3-day event, which brings together black consciousness to the city. So there would be talks, there are pop-up libraries selling books and all sorts, and it's a place of fun and culture where people are able to show off and listen to people from around the world. And on that day in 77, I took a photograph in Handsworth Park, listening to a crowd, and it perhaps was the largest assembled crowd of people from the African Caribbean community. And I felt about that at the time. I did feel it would be an important photograph. I just sort of braved to myself to go up and take the photograph. It's in Handsworth Park, which is not too far from here, and because I felt it was important. It was absolutely important that I took that photograph. I was a little bit, although I was here to take photographs, I remember I didn't take some photographs because we were very conscious of being watched at the time, and quite, rightly or wrongly, we were informed that the CIA and other British intelligence were, were capable of not just watching but also using the material that I would generate. So I was quite conscious not to photograph any of the people visiting lecturers who would have come from America, the Caribbean, Africa, and so on. And I concentrated on the crowd much more on that occasion. So the photograph is, I can't remember which of the day. I think it's day one, when there's a rally that takes place around the streets. And so you'd have an assemblage, you'd have your meetings, speakers would speak, and then after that we'd take to the streets. And I think the posters that were carried in those times are, if you like, an indication of the seriousness with which the situation was viewed. Because, and another thing is, we don't just respond to what's happening in England or Birmingham, we respond to what's happening worldwide. So at the time, we were having problems with the whole colonial war in Africa. You had the Portuguese, Guinea-Bissau, you have Angola, you have South Africa, Namibia, Tanzania, the Congo. All of these places were erupting to a greater or lesser extent, and we reacted to that as well. So the march at these events would be one for the liberation of all black people. But again, those conversations were largely, they were never heard, really. And so for me, the documentation is part of that, preserving that material for future generations. I've always felt that we should provide material and make it available so future generation won't have to go looking for this material. It should be readily available. I remember while I was doing that, we didn't have much material, if you like, to look at, and where it was available, because you couldn't cross-reference this thing. If a black man, if in the 60s or 70s, a black guy come up and say, "Hey, black man invent the traffic light," you'd say, "Go on a rubbish lie, I tell." You know what I mean? And that's from a black person. You had to have it either verified by a white person, or to have a book or something to. But with the advent of the internet now, that information can be flashed around quite easily, and it can be cross-referenced. So it makes it much more easier to digest. But in the early days, there was none of that. So my idea was really to collect, not just to document the lived experience, but to collect part of that experience as well in the form of ephemera that relates to us as a people. I felt that the story just wasn't in the photograph, or wouldn't reside just in the photograph, but also in the objects. So I would collect things like the radiogram, the paraffin lamp, the cabinet, anything that resonates with a story, anything that contains a story, or anything that indicates, if you like, that triggers this conversation. And a good example perhaps is a paraffin lamp. I was with a few women, I think about 4 women, and I mentioned a paraffin lamp, and just left it, and the conversation started, and one said she liked the paraffin lamp because she used to like the pattern it created on the wall, and another one said she didn't like it because it really stank when you're on the bus, your clothes. And another one said, well, I hate it because it killed my sister. She had a fire in the house. And just from that one object, you get those many response. And I think if you had another 10 people, you'd get 10 other response from that same object. I think it's how do we awaken the conversation or the lived experience around these objects, and and that's when, if you like, we relate to the older generation to record or to document those stories, and so they have good material to use to research. So that's how they grow up, with the archive. And amongst that, I collect newspapers, pretty well anything that informs us as a people. So we'd have videos, old videos, cassettes. So it's not just the objects, but the material to play them on. Lots of vinyl, because vinyl was one of the only means by which we had a voice. And I even have some old blues events that I've photographed, and I think I've got recording of. And the blues is where, if you like, a lot of information was disseminated, because a lot of people didn't have a telephone. It was you hear it at the blues at night. A man gets shot down the road, or this has happened, and that's where the response really comes from. So it's all very important. So I collect all of those stories, together. With coming back to the event of Africa Liberation Day in Handsworth, which was one of the larger ones, very well organized. As I said, you can see from the posters, in some of the photographs, just how serious. We talk about, in the photographs, it talks about, as I said, what was happening in South Africa. It talked about, how do you solve the problem? We're seeing the thing. Obviously, guns were not such a problem in the community, but we see there now, a gun talks. I can't think of all of them at the moment, but the various statements in the posters, which are quite similar to what's happening today. I think it's just the more extreme ones because of events that's changed over the years. So no one walks down the road and say a gun talks, or with a poster like that, because of that. But it's nonetheless as important as ever, and the story continues. I haven't taken many photographs of this occasion. One, because of the shutdown. I have a vulnerable mother, and I just felt that I should keep away. Herbert H. Walters, he has been taking some photographs, some quite interesting ones too, important documentation, and I've more or less been spending my time here and doing some other bits and pieces, and some other work, but in different ways, but not going out to take documentary photographs.